Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's my pleasure to introduce Surya Vanka, who's going to be talking to us about design mind and engineering mind, a combination of design and engineering. So I can't wait for this. My name's Stuart Tansey. I'm responsible with Kristin Toll for the natural user interactions area, our theme in external research. And we're responsible for the 2 days of natural user interaction presentations that you're hearing. This one's very special. This one represents the bridge between all this computing stuff and computer science stuff that we're so familiar with and the design world. And I hope Surya is going to explain how that's connected in Microsoft. It also represents a bridge between the Design Expo, which has been long associated for many years with Faculty Summit, and you'll see why design appears so often in Faculty Summit. Surya.
Thank you, Stuart. Hi, folks. How's the morning been so far? Yeah? Interesting? What stuck out so far for you? Anything interesting this morning that you liked? Yeah? Connect. Okay, great. So, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be speaking at the Faculty Summit. I personally feel like I'm among my peeps. I have a background as faculty. I taught at the University of Illinois for many years, before I came to Microsoft, and it's wonderful to be here sharing again with my peeps in that sense. So what I'm going to speak about today may be something a little bit different, a little bit complementary to what you've been hearing in the other sessions. This is the center of gravity of my talk is going to be design. I'm an industrial designer, and my role at Microsoft is that I am responsible for shepherding the user experience discipline at Microsoft, which is about 800 designers and user researchers. So these are folks who don't write code. These are folks who go observe human beings. These are folks who are visual designers. These are interaction designers. These are ethnographers. These are folks who really try to take the great technologies that we've got and make them useful, usable, and desirable for human beings. And so I'm going to talk about how this particular capability of thinking human first fits with this larger engineering capability. So my talk is about what I call the design mind and the engineering mind. And during the course of the next hour or so, I am actually going to be going fairly quickly, and I'm going to be covering a lot of ground. And we'll first talk a little bit about design and this why we are living in an age of design. And I'm going to look at it a little historical view and then try and bring us back to the present and see how that connects with what we're doing at Microsoft. Right? And finally, I'm going to share with you a few principles that we use at Microsoft when we're designing. So here we see the classic Renaissance man, right? The Leonardo da Vinci, the artist, scientist. And we're going to, when I'm talking of design mind and engineering mind, I'm going to reference that about this kind of complementarity of both. You know, we live in an interesting time. It is what you could call the age of design. The evidence of the power of design is everywhere, right? You see in literature, rise of the creative class. We live in the experience economy, right? That's the buzz. Has anyone read Daniel Pink's book, A Whole New Mind, right? He makes a pretty compelling case, right, for design. He talks about how design's on the rise, and the three forces, the three A's as he calls them: abundance, people have a lot more purchasing power; automation, the ability to make stuff; and Asia, outsourcing, right? There's a lot more places that are being able to create stuff, right? And so the word designer is almost everywhere. And we are living at a time where there's this kind of a time of ferment, a time where we are in a new laboratory of design. Let's go back and look at where there were the previous laboratories of design. Let's go back in time a little bit. Now we are in the 14th century in Florence, right? This is the birthplace of the Renaissance, right? In a very short amount of time, there was this enormous explosion of art and science coming together, and really in a very designerly way. What made it happen here? Why at this particular time? In a span of maybe 50 to 100 years, really, when it happened, in a very small geographical area. This was a time when we had Sandro Botticelli doing the Birth of Venus. For us, this enduring masterpiece is something that, we take for granted. But at that time, if you think about it, it was in a time when the church was very strong and all art was really informed by the Roman Catholic Church. This was this pagan piece, and it barely survived the bonfires that such pieces were subject to. It was a time when we had Michelangelo, right? Maybe the greatest painter who ever lived. Two of the greatest masterpieces of Western art, the two frescoes in the Sistine Chapel on the ceiling and on the wall, created by Michelangelo. Very interesting person. He was somebody who was bridging disciplines. He was a sculptor, an architect, a poet, an engineer. And actually, interestingly, he had kind of a disdain for painting. How weird is that? And then this is the same time, one of the other contemporaries here was, of course, the archetypal Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci, the bridge between art and science. And talk about somebody who was probably one of the greatest multi-talented people who ever lived. He was scientist, mathematician, engineer, inventor, anatomist, painter, sculptor, architect, botanist, musician, all one human being. Maybe the most multi-talented person to have ever lived, right? So these two gentlemen are sometimes credited with creating the Renaissance. These are the Medicis, and the gentleman to your right is Lorenzo de' Medici. And these folks acted as the executive sponsors, really, of the Renaissance. Sometimes there are theories about maybe the Renaissance and all this kind of this laboratory of design that happened in Florence in the 14th century was because of the sponsorship of these folks. In fact, it's not the whole story, because in other cities there were other sponsors, but it turned out something important happened in Florence. Right? There are other theories. There's the theory which is called the great men theory, because Botticelli and Da Vinci and Michelangelo were all born in Tuscany. Another theory is that maybe it is just this strange coincidence that these people are here and therefore it happened in Florence. But actually, when you look around, it's not true. There were a lot more folks involved, and they actually came to Florence from different places. Right? And it's interesting to see what was it about the prevailing country. Others say maybe it is just that the culture of the time was so open that it allowed this kind of thinking that bridge disciplines and so on to happen. In fact, if you look at it, that's not the case. This was a highly feudal, repressive place, right? The powers were extremely hierarchical. The church was the feudal system, a very repressive church. The Pope, a series of popes had actually been fairly tough guys. They had these, they were driven by superstition, and they decreed all kinds of things, trying to keep Satan at bay and so on. One of the popes, in fact, had all the cats in Italy slaughtered, right? Because he said they represented Satan. So it was not this very open place. It was a place where wealth was being created for a few, and a large number of people were actually fairly oppressed. And it's, in fact, when you look at that, this one of the roots that you find of what eventually leads to the Renaissance happening in Florence. So there was this, in this highly stratified society, there were these new exotic tastes that were rising. These tastes for silk from China and spices from the Spice Islands and so on. And it set off this huge dot-com boom, really, of shipbuilders who set off to go and get these things. And they'd go and they'd bring it back for the people with the disposable income. And it turns out when they came back, they brought some with them, some cargo that was unintended. One of them was a black rat, not native to Europe. right? It came from Asia, and the black rat brought with it, it was a host for the plague, the bubonic plague. And in fact, that's one of the roots where you find that Italy was the place which was the epicenter of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, right? All of the ships that came back brought these things, and it, of course, brought absolute chaos. 60 to 80% of Italy's population perished. And guess what was the epicenter of the plague? It was actually Florence. Most of Florence was decimated. The whole society turned upside down, right? And from this situation where the workforces were depleted and workers had more bargaining power, the pent-up kind of creative potential was released, we come to this burst of creativity called the Renaissance. So it's not a coincidence that immediately after the plague we have the Renaissance happening in Florence, right? In a very short amount of time. And we start to see it in art, and we start to see Galileo Galilei, again, one of the great scientific minds, Stephen Hawking says Galileo, perhaps more than any other single person, was responsible for the birth of modern science. So a lot of interesting things happening, which are really, from this hopeless time, comes this kind of hope of bringing together this multidisciplinary kind of view that reinvents the world, right? So this is not the only time this kind of ferment, this kind of laboratory has come together. If we fast forward to the beginning of the last century and we come to North America, we see another time where this kind of laboratory, where this kind of multidisciplinary thinking, crossing engineering and art happened. And this is in New York. Here we're looking at the Futurama exhibit. Norman Bell Geddes, one of a stage designer, a architect, and this is at the World's Fair, and he provided this amazing vision of the future in the Futurama vision. And it was interesting. You hear him say things like, they should, think about it. At this point, automobiles were just coming around, and automobiles essentially were just crisscrossing the landscape. This is the guy who thinks maybe there's something called a highway. He says there should be no more reason for a motorist who's passing through a city to slow down than there's for an airplane passing over it. And he becomes the father of this whole notion of the highway system, a vision of the future. He goes on to invent in the early 30s. He's very prolific in designing consumer devices, graphics, automobiles, a whole bunch of things. And he's not the only one. There's a lot of ferment that's happening in the early 30s to the early 40s. And if we go back a few years, we see that that is just a few years after 29th of October 1929. And what is that? That's, of course, the big Wall Street crash, right? Black Tuesday. In a single day, 9,000 banks go down. From an age of some great optimism, everything collapses very quickly. And from here, we see that this kind of blight spreads across the country. And it is in this time, again, this very hopeless time, you see the rise of, again, another kind of force in society. And you start to see the growth of engineering and design come to Raymond Loewy's design practice starts with the Avanti Starlight and the sort of a heroic vision of a new future. This is when Walter Darwin Teague starts to reinvent our domestic landscape. This is when the modern Leonardo of our times, in some way, Henry Dreyfuss invents the human scale. This sort of first abstract model of human beings that can be used to design ergonomics and design against in terms of creating a sort of a comfortable environment. And again, you see a bunch of the icons like the Princess telephone that emerge out of here. Once again, so obviously you can tell there's a theme over here, which is, again, from the crisis of the Great Depression, we see, again, the forces that catalyze the coming together of a new view, right? And I'm sure you sort of read the subtext or where I'm going for, that we live in an age of opportunity because we are seeing we live in another kind of interesting crisis moment, right? And this is a great time, actually, to be another great laboratory of design. And we start to see that happening. Let's take a look. If we come and fast forward to today, on the one side you see the tea kettle designed by Michael Graves for the Italian company Alessi, a very beautiful tea kettle which was designed in 1985, and a hefty price tag meant to be owned by a few. And then you see Michael Graves designed the other tea kettle a few years ago for Target, right? And they're identical. In fact, the Target tea kettle is just a slightly little bit better, right? So we are seeing a trend towards a democratization of design. Design not being this kind of boutique-y, exclusive thing just for a few, but design as something that pervades every part of our society. And if you think back to what we mentioned about Daniel Pink, abundance, automation, outsourcing, all of these things, we are now looking at an age where it is possible for the benefits of design really to reach everybody, right? And mass-produced objects now are getting to a place where they have some of the values and the benefits of good design that is centered around human beings. Right? Let's go ahead and take a quick trip now to connect to what we are speaking about today, to one of the largest mass-manufactured products that exists and how design has influenced it. And I'm talking Windows. Okay? This is, we're time traveling back to 1985. This is Windows 1.0, right? 55 programmers designed this in the space of 1 year, right? It was a absolutely revolutionary technology because it changed the course of computing. What did it do? It unleashed the technical capabilities inside microchips. It was used by a few technical enthusiasts, but primarily technologies pushing out to become a product, right? As far as from a human point of view, there's, these fixed tiled windows, you couldn't move them, nothing could overlap. There's these sort of childlike colors. And we move forward. We go to 1987, and here we're at Windows 2.0, right? Biggest achievement here was that you could run MS-DOS applications simultaneously. And then we move forward, 1990, this is Windows 3.0. And now we have, the greatest achievement here is the ability to address memory above 640K, right? There is an enhanced mode, you can do some page swapping. But again, a lot of technological progress that's happening, but nothing really from a user point of view. It's not coming outside in, it's inside out. And then we come to Windows 95, and there's a little bit of shift here, because this is a product now that goes broader. It brings excitement to a marketplace. For the first time, 40 million copies of this product gets sold. This is no longer for a small minority of people, the technical enthusiasts. This is for everybody. This actually drives people to go out and buy computers, right? This is first piece of software that drives hardware sales. And we move forward, and now we go to XP, and now there's another shift. The recognition that there are multiple kinds of users. There's a professional version, right? And there is a home user version. Entertainment now becomes a legitimate thing to do with a computer. And there's much more. We start to see the technology being designed outside in, right? Human needs in rather than only technical capabilities out. And we move forward, and then we come to Vista, and this is when we have in the midst of the whole security debacle that's happening, where things are going nuts and crazy, and there's some sort of values here of trying to create a consistent, pleasant experience. But of course, these don't really come together till we come to Windows 7. And Windows 7, actually, you see, it's quite different from if we go back to Windows 1.0 or Windows 3.0, which is, it is completely designed on human scenarios. Now it is a human being in, not microchip out. right? And we start to see there's really a sea change here about the amount of intelligence about human beings that is built into this. What is happening here? This is, at Microsoft, it has meant that the meaning of design, the value of design has changed. It used to be this luxury where you built your product, and if you could get those designer kind of people involved in the product, that would be absolutely fabulous, but you need to get your product out to where we're at a point where design is absolutely critical and front and center and what really gets the product started. Right? So big sea change, and this is not happening only at Microsoft. But if we go back and look at this sort of age of design, the experience economy, all of that we're talking about, this is something that is happening in multiple sectors at the same time. And here is kind of an interesting model that we can look at. This is a model first described by Paul Kunkel in his book about Sony Design Center called Digital Dreams, and something that Ziba Design, a really interesting design consultancy in Portland, actually built on. So here it talks about how every technology has a predictable life cycle, which from a sunrise to a point where it gets to a noon hour and then finally a sunset. And what happens at these different phases? And this could be the technology of automobiles or operating system or shoes or whatever. Early on in the development of a technology, what do we see? We see technology innovation. Think Windows 1.0, right? This is just getting the darn thing to work, right? This is about efficacy, feasibility, science. And then as we move forward, move to a place where it's product innovation, from technology innovation. And this is when the technology goes broad. It's not just the enthusiasts who use it, but we see a larger part of the market start to use it. Think Windows 95. Now it's functionality, manufacturability, configurability, productization, all of these are the concerns. It is really going widely in the market. And there is a certain point when really these technologies become much more commodities, and there's much more stabilization of technology. And again, the concerns shift. And this is where we can think we move to a qualitatively different stage, which we can call experience innovation, right? Now the concerns shift. The human being starts to become a very important part of it. It's not just the curve, the arc of technology. It is about narrative, theme, scenario, style, metaphor. These are sort of new languages, new words that come into engineering at this point. Right? And we see at this point there's these notions such as how do you build loyalty, how do you build trust, how do you build joy, how do you build emotion, and so on. Right? Loyalty is an important one, right? Because if we have the contract between a person who buys something and people who make things, right? The contract is you give me your loyalty and buy my product as you consumer, me maker. In return, I promise you trust, right? I promise you that I will make products that meet I understand you, and I make products that truly fit your needs and make them worthy of your trust. It's interesting to look at what's happening in a macro framework with trust these days. Now, one of the channels of conversation between consumers and producers is advertising, and television advertising, the big one of that. Here's an interesting study. So about $90 billion are spent a year in television advertising, and these folks from Columbia did a study saying, of these $90 billion, if you go and ask consumers, right, how much trust is that generating? How many people have a positive opinion? How many consumers? Turns out only about 40% of consumers have any positive opinion of advertising. And if you go back and ask producers, the people paying for the advertising, how much value are you getting from it? Only about 22% of the advertisers say they're getting any value from television advertising. They don't think that this is a very compelling, trustworthy way that they're able to reach. And in fact, when you talk about trust and belief, you ask customers, how many of you actually believe the messages? Only 6% of customers believe what they're seeing in ads to be anywhere that's true, right? So this whole relationship of trust and loyalty, lots of interesting things happening in our time right now, And why? We are actually, the ground is shifting under our feet. We are in the midst of a massive power shift, And the power shift is, of course, economy of scale to choice. We've gone from very simple markets to extremely complex interconnected markets. We've gone from the whole idea of national markets to you don't know where your product came from anymore. And we're going from the customer who was the opportunistic customer who wanted the best price for a product to the cynical customer who wants it for free and wants it yesterday, right? And one of probably the most significant shift that we have to pay attention to is we are going from extrinsic value to intrinsic value. From does it work to does it give me joy, right? And the power shift is one from a time where the people who had capital, people who had manufacturing, controlled the market, were in power, the producers in power. We are going to a point where the consumer is extremely powerful, right? And it's a very interesting kind of power. And the natural arc this moves us towards is the place where we're building for markets of one, where they're individually customized products for individual human beings. And we already see that in services, and we see it in some software products. Netflix is doing that today, right? It is building products for customized for every individual customer. Services are the leading edge of this, right? So my point so far, just to recap what we have talked about, we are in this age of design, right? And it is a different place, and there's some huge shifts happening, and designing at this time requires different kind of capabilities. Let's take a look at the challenges of design at this time. Word 1.0 had 49 menu commands. Then what happened? Over time, a lot more capability got built into Microsoft Word, but with it, of course, came this complexity, the cognitive burden, right? People needed the capability, but with it, an old paradigm that also had a lot of cognitive burden. We build a lot of products, 200 products a year, which means the pace that you're designing for increases a lot. It is not just pace, it is the number of people. 1 billion people will use Windows. 1 billion people use Windows, and you're designing for enormous scale. And this scale is not homogeneous. You know, if you think about just Windows, it's in 130 different languages. That's an enormous diversity that one has to handle. And it is not simply a single product, but it's a product that is a platform where 650,000 companies are building it on top of it. So it means you're designing for partnering. And you're not only designing for external partnering, you're designing even within any large company, when you're building a large product, for internal partnering, because we have 360 teams all running in parallel, so which means you're building for collaboration. At the same time, we are seeing the dematerialization of products. Products are turning into slabs of glass and metal that run software, right? We are seeing the shift from just atoms to atoms and pixels and services. Yeah? And that's all happening really quickly. And when we're trying to make a world, once again, we think about in the stage of experience innovation, trying to make a world that's joyful, pleasing, usable for customers. This is actually the world they inhabit today. It's noisy, it's anxiety creating, it's got a whole bunch of things that are being thrown at folks, and it turns out it's what we used to train people to do professionally, and we expect the average consumer to be able to cope with that right now. So, what is the meaning of designing in our times? The meaning of designing in our times is really a little different. Technology innovations are being fabulous in mastering complexity, and the huge challenge really is how do we master simplicity with all of this? What we're really talking about is wicked problems, right? Wicked problems, very, very large-scale problems with no clear stopping rule, with a lot of contradictory requirements, and when we try to solve these problems, typically we have taken the very strong analytical approach, which is to take a problem, cut it down to pieces, solve the sub-pieces, and pull it back together. And through this, we've done fabulous things. We've put people on the moon, we've gone into sort of microspaces and built microelectronics and so on. And the whole notion here is fix all the parts, put the parts together, and then you get your big solution. It's turning out that a lot of that is not working in the experience innovation phase. right? We need, and we have relied on a fabulous capability, the analytical mind, the engineering mind, the left brain, which uses certain capabilities which are based on that exact method that I talked about, deconstructing and reconstructing. It turns out there are other ways to look at problems more holistically, which is to keep the whole problem in view, but just change resolution of how you look at the problem. And this is the capability of the other mind that we have, right? This is the design mind. This is the mind that tends to preserve the whole view of the problem, but is able to selectively view it in different ways. It is the risk-taking mind. It is the mind that values creativity and so on. And really, in addressing the challenges of our time, the only way to be able to really build products that are compelling, useful, and really that serve needs are really to think about it in terms of whole brain creativity, using, in a very strategic way, the left brain and the right brain. And when you bring those together, we're talking of actually deploying multiple kinds of capabilities, using deductive reasoning that goes from the general to the specific, combined with the inductive reasoning that goes from the very specific data gathering to creating the large, to another kind of thinking, the abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning, which is the reasoning of what could be. Here's the example of the Aeron chair. Folks familiar with the Aeron chair? Anyone familiar? I see a couple of hands, right? So, most successful office chair in history, and it turned the whole idea of office chair upside down, took the machine out instead of inside. But when it was proposed first by Bill Stumpf and Don Chadwick for Herman Miller, it was completely shot down because people said, that looks like a machine. Nobody's ever going to buy that, right? But this is abductive reasoning, assuming that something like this may actually meet needs. It is, from a value system, thinking people first rather than technology first. It is this kind of whole brain creativity values experimentalism, values that even the boundary, wacky, strange idea, the edge case idea, has extreme value. It values optimism, that in every product there's a better way to get at solving it. These are some examples from Xbox 360 early work. It values collaboration, that multiple ways of thinking are fundamentally required to be able to attack these kind of large-scale complex problems. And it values observation, that by observing human beings are first-class objects, and by observing human beings there is much insight to be gained that can be utilized in designing products. So how does this actually play out? I'm going to just go through a real quick example. There is one of our successful products is a Microsoft Laser Mouse 6000. Has been a really product that's got a lot of awards, and it's doing well in business and so on. And just in a couple of snapshots, how did this product start? It started as a whole bunch of about 300 strange ideas of what a mouse could be, right? This is that kind of the design mind thinking, those experimental and so on. And then there is the engineering mind that actually starts to analyze this, test this, and build the theories of what works, what doesn't work. Comes down to a smaller set. And then again it goes out and experiments with a few more, which comes down finally to the final product. This very simple set of 4 slides actually talks about how the process that we think about building products is this sawtooth accordion kind of process of alternative convergences and divergences, the divergences being of this sort of opening exploratory design mind, and the convergence being of the rigorous engineering mind. There's a gentleman, and what you see here is kind of a typical product cycle. There's a gentleman called So who talks about this in the design process. There's actually 2 simultaneous processes having. One is a process of elaboration. At the same time is the process of reduction, right? And it's how you get the dance of both of these going together in a cycle of this, again, what I'm calling the design mind and the engineering mind helps. Orchestrating this helps you create these successful products. In the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through a few principles now of how we see these 2 principles playing when we're building products at Microsoft. These are by no means exhaustive or comprehensive, but these give you an illustration. A principle which actually is something from a very smart person, David Kelly, who runs a design consultancy called IDEO, says, you cannot know the tiger until you live in the jungle. What does that mean for us? We cannot understand the user by being in our Redmond offices or in our laboratories. We have to go be with the users of our products. There's a program called Living with Windows where researchers from the Windows team go and live with our customers. This is not for an hour or an afternoon or for a day or a week. This is for months at end, right? And in some cases, actually living in their homes, right? In other cases, not living in their homes, but this is called Living with Windows. Another, you need to gather deep evidence, but deep user evidence, right? When we were building the last version of Office, that's the amount of user evidence that we're capturing. Some of it is coming through instrumentation, some of it is coming through focus groups, some is coming through usability studies, a lot of the generative user evidence. We need to understand intimacy and scale. So there are ethnographic methods which are wonderful at being able to get deep, intimate views of human beings. Right? These are anthropological, ethnographic, contextual kind of methods. And there are other methods that are classic behavioral methods, which are great in controlled environments around specific paths to be able to understand how large groups of people behave. And they kind of pull in different directions. But when you pull these together with something you can call scaled intimacy, you get an intimate view of how large groups of people, those billion people you're serving, but you still want to serve in an intimate way, how that comes together. And we have a bunch of methods based on that, and we get some credit for that in various magazines. We talk about creating rich, evocative models. So here are models. This is what you're seeing is an eye tracking study. So this is somebody's retina being followed as they are looking across a screen, and this how long the retina pauses at a certain point shows the color. And when you start to pull a whole bunch of people looking at an early prototype, you start to see, are people really gazing and discovering things the way you want to do it? We build models of not just human behavior, but models of organization, but different kind of model. We believe in another principle of building virtuous feedback loops. Here's an example. When you get a piece of beta software, like in this case it's Windows, on the bottom right-hand side of the screen you might see a little red frowny face and a green smiley face. And if you happen to have a good experience, you can click the green smiley face, and then you can send back comments saying, hey, this is working well for me, this feature you're doing and thinking of works well. You can you can send the frowny face, and all of that's coming together. Thousands of these are coming together and providing a real-time heat map really of customer satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Another thing we do is what we call co-creation, pulling the customer, the user, right into the process. Right? This is Microsoft Connect. This is a open database that anyone can log bugs against Microsoft products, and those actually go into our real bug database. This is not some fake database, and there's a commitment to resolve those bugs. Right? So it is how do you pull people right into the process. When we're building games, we have a process called playtest. And playtest is an interesting process. We have these playtest labs. And last night's version of a game, say Halo 4, young gamers come in, because it is young gamers who want to play Halo 4, and they sit around for a day playing this, and while they're playing this, the consoles they're playing are instrumented, so we're actually gathering a lot of information. There's videotape, there's subjective feedback. By the end of the day, all that is gathered together in a form, so designers now have an understanding of opportunities, problems, and so on, that they can work on the next version of the game. So there's a very quick iterative cycle where you really start to get a point of who is designer, who is user, because there's a co-creation cycle where they're really tightly working with each other. Another principle that we have is you have to validate with user data, but you have to lead with design, because being in the business of technology and understanding technology, there is a certain a role one has of being the storyteller of technology. Right? Technologies are becoming more and more invisible. So for example, when we looked at Windows and thought about having DVR capability, that you could actually record your movies and music and then be able to play it back, and took that to consumers, they said, that's silly. Windows is for writing documents. Why would you use it as a digital video recorder? But when they were shown the vision of the Windows Media Player and how that might work, the response was quite different. And actually, that has been a very successful version of Windows Media Player. Right? So you have to still lead with design. Just by co-creating with the user and so on, you cannot completely abnegate your responsibility of designing. Now, the principle is to fail fast. Right? We're a software company, and there is sometimes a tendency to want to write code. But code has some bad habits. If you write code, it tends to be expensive, and code tends to sometimes have a life if you're not careful in unintended ways. So we try to create habits where you fail fast. This was actually the first prototype of one of the versions of Excel. Right? We try to find ways that very, very quickly you can build ideas and throw them away and get all the bad ideas out of the way so you can get to the good ideas. Inventing new paradigms. As products change, rethinking them becomes absolutely important. So this is this desktop mouse, which I happen to be using. Now, when I'm, my hand, it fits comfortably in my hand, but it turns out that when I'm traveling, it's not so handy to have such a big, so it's kind of handy to be able to fold it over. Right? And this is a very successful mouse for the reason that it is resolving the contradictions of the fact that you need a portable mouse when you're traveling, but your hand doesn't change in size. Right? Other kind of paradigm, this is the Zune HD, and it has some interesting kind of paradigm shift because it has a radio, it has a way that you can toss songs from one player to another, it has ways to that you, if you're listening to a song on the radio, you can buy it right away. So really, rethinking the paradigm. This is on Zune HD, what's called a mix view. And the mix view is kind of interesting. If you're listening to a piece of music, you can start to see kind of the etymology of the music. You can see what music influenced that and so on. So it lets you discover music in different kinds of ways. Right? So change the paradigm of music listening. And then, of course, surface computing. I won't talk about it because I'm sure you've come across some of that. Another principle that we talk about a lot, simplicity is hard. Simplicity is really hard. We called it the big innovation challenge, but it's really worth striving for. Let's go back and look at our friend Microsoft Word with 49 menu commands. And then as more and more capability of blogging and being able to publish directly on the internet came along, look what happened. It started to get really complicated. And year after year, we'd go back to our customer and say, we really want to change this interface and make it, we know you're having trouble. We know that everyone is using only 6% of the capability in Word, and we want to change it. But we also know that everyone's using a different 6%. And we also know that there's about 15 to 20 years of training in a particular paradigm, right? So we had to figure out a way to be able to simplify this and yet not place this huge burden of relearning, right? And there came a point where we really had to look at the paradigm and say, the previous paradigm was find and use. You needed to get something done in your productivity software, so you went and found it and used it. But given the huge amount of capability there, we really had to go back to first principles and look at that. So the paradigm really has shifted to what we can say is use and find. You use, and it is now the responsibility of the software to find the right kind of capability and present it to you. And this is, instantiated as the ribbon. So if I'm writing a document, the ribbon provides some capability. Now say it's a tablet computer and I pick up my tablet, the ribbon changes. And it has found me in terms of my capability. And it will now change contextually based. Another principle, never sacrifice clarity for depth, right? We love making stuff, right? We're a software company. We like building widgets. We like building more and more stuff. And there's always a tendency to build more. And so as a principle, to be able to reduce and clarify becomes very important. Xbox 360 has been very successful. And some of its success has to be with what kind of capability was not exposed, right? What kind of a clear scaffold is exposed so that you can tie that with a service very clearly, and it becomes very easy to understand. Finally, there is, we talk about measurement a lot in software, and we tend to think about performance, we tend to think about it as bug counts. We can also measure the experience. Experience is something that's measurable, and we do a lot around that. How we have experience scorecards for all of our products where we have certain experience goals, and every stage of the process we measure, is the experience up there? And this experience is on sort of more rigid criteria such as task completion, time on task, and so on, but it's also about how joyful something feels, right? So it's a squishy stuff as well that can be measured. So a few principles. So these principles, and once again to recap where we're going, the thread of my argument, we're talking about how we need this whole brain creativity of the design mind and the engineering mind. How do we actually start to bring it into the process of product development of engineering in a company like Microsoft? Now, one of the interesting things that happens at Microsoft and other places today is because products have been built in engineering cultures, typically you would find that the kind of proportions of folks who bring one kind of creativity, the engineering creativity, versus folks who bring the more design creativity are not in the same proportions, right? We have something like 1 designer to every 48 developers, and we have the best ratio, right? We have the highest ratio of developer to designer of any company, and we have 1 to 48, right? So we cannot really get a system that is well balanced in terms of whole brain creativity just by saying you need to have more designers in the mix. You have to use other ways of it. And so the change in the role of designer itself at Microsoft is rethought, and it is not simply to be a design hero. It is really what we think about designers at Microsoft really need to be team heroes, right? And part of being a team hero is not only being able to bring the design mind, but also train cultures to embrace other forms of thinking. So the vocabulary within this company is changing very quickly. The vocabulary is taking on these aspects of whole brain creativity, and gathering things from this other kind of world. And so when we think of the role of the design mind and the engineering mind, so there is an aspect which is not just innovation in products, but also innovation culture. Roger Martin's an interesting gentleman. He has written anyone heard of Roger Martin? He's the dean of the Rotman School of Business, and he's probably one of the leading design thinkers of our time. And he's written this book called The Opposable Mind. Brilliant book. If you get a chance, do read it. And in that, he talks about how business people, a key thing that they need to do is become designers, not just understand designers, because he talks about how there is this capability that design brings that has become key to business, to be able to solving big business problems. And what he's talking about is not that everyone picks up design tools and starts designing user interfaces or design products, but he's talking about the concept of what we could call the little d and the big D. The little d, which is designing of artifact, the big D, which is designing of really the entire organization, process, engineering systems, cultures, and so on. So a compelling case. And when we think about how this process plays out at Microsoft, we are also thinking about a maturity model. There is a professor at Lancaster University, Professor Junginger. She's got a model of the maturity of design in organizations, where there is a certain point when this kind of thinking, design thinking, lives outside of the organization as a satellite almost. And it's kind of like a resource. Think back to when I said design was a luxury at Microsoft. It is something that's optional if there is time to add on to your product. And it's a resource to the organization. And then the maturity cycle changes and becomes a fundamental part of the organization as one of the peer players of disciplines. And then it becomes something that's core to the organization as a way that informs how you build products themselves, right? As a primary starting point. And there's a certain stage which she talks about where design is the organization. Right? Every aspect of the organization is informed with this designerly thinking. And she uses this sort of big D as kind of a whole brain thinking, connecting both the design and the engineering thinking. So in closing, it's a fundamentally wonderful time to be sort of in business, in this time where there's a lot of interesting opportunities. And one piece of it is really how we evolve and change and sort of start to bring other capabilities that we don't have. And we think, and I like this quote from Bob Dylan, if you're not busy being born, you're busy dying. So, in this process of being born, a part that I see, it's really this whole brain creativity, how we are trying to bring together the two sides of the brain to build those products that are not just great in terms of their engineering capability and technical capability, but how they fit human beings. Thank you very much, and we have about 5 minutes for a conversation. Yes, ma'am. And there's a mic running around. Please speak into it for the video.
Thank you. I just wonder what kind of metrics you have been used to measure experience, especially the emotion part, the more intangible, implicit part of a design.
Yeah.
How could you measure the elegant, delayed, beside the traditional usability engineering metrics?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, we have something which we call the desirability toolkit. And so it's a set of tools which we use through a bunch of subjective measures. Some of them are, for example, in the playtest situation. You remember the game design where I said the Halo, I used the example of Halo in the playtest where gamers come in. So we've got a number of measurements that are being triangulated, so there is measurements on performance. Did a person get to the next level or whatever, right? So those are simply about performance. But then we're also concerned about, how are you feeling at that time, right? And so one of the concepts that we think about is flow state. Maybe familiar, Mihaly, Csikszentmihalyi, this book, Flow, the state of optimal experience, where you balance challenge versus achievement, right? So in a game space, that is perfect. So how you feel is very important. So in that case, we're just using subjective measures about how somebody feels. And pretty simple subjective measures are enough, Likert scales and so on, right? And then there are other cases where we actually have hardware devices that are helping people turn knobs and so on, say I'm happy to sad and so on. And then if you think about even the send a smile example I showed you, a smiley face, frowny face, it is really getting to certain emotional states, right? What's interesting is researchers, when all the data comes back, it's the analysis behind on the other end to see what is that actually connecting to emotional states folks have. Did I answer your question? Great. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Regarding the design culture in the organization, do you think that Microsoft can learn something from Apple?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's wonderful to have a competitor like Apple that has, really instilled design so deeply into their organization, right? So it's obviously different, right? It is, we have a platform play, we have ecosystem, there's lots of different parts. So it wouldn't be exactly a one-to-one comparison, right? Because let's say the weakest link in an experience can be what defines an experience, right? Whether it is your provider of your wireless service or whether it is how your keyboard feels or whatever it is. And so there are different kind of ways that both companies do it. One is, of course, taking an approach where they're very tightly controlling the experience. And this is a different platform play that we are in, right? What is very interesting to me, of course, is the great traction we're making in an ecosystem space to build great experiences. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Great.
So I have a harder version of the same question.
Yes.
So on an absolute and relative scale, it seems like Microsoft has more designers than Google or Apple. And yet I think the general population would probably say that their products on the first version and future versions tend to be easier to use. So I guess my question is, why is that? Is it how designers are organized at Microsoft? Is it a question of talent? Is it a question of training? Is it a question of culture? And I'm also asking this question because I teach human-computer interaction, and I really like to understand why is this the case, and what can I tell the students?
Sure. A couple of things. Good question. A couple of things. One is, so I've been here 10 years, and when I joined, I think I was designer number 30, right? So for the one thing, we're seeing a huge acceleration in commitment to design, right? The past of Microsoft is not being a design-centered company. The past of Microsoft has been an engineering-centered company. We've been a technology-centered company, right? We're seeing this change, right? So now there are 800 people, and that change, and a lot of that growth has happened in the past few years. So that's one, the numbers. I think the other thing is the footprint at the moment is that we've got is fairly large. I mentioned the 200 products of shipping, which what is that? 200 products a year, whatever, 4 products a week. So there's a very large footprint. So that's another aspect of where we're seeing it. So we're gaining traction. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. So you kind of see it as there are some every year we win some of the big design awards on a regular basis, but it's not for all of our products, but for some products. And we're moving to a place where we're hoping to do it across all of our products. I've got the wrap-up sign from the lady at the back, and I'm going to be obedient and stop. Thank you very much for your time.
Will you be on the